Good evening. Today is Monday, March 6, 2023, and this is the 140th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. Before we begin our podcast tonight, I do want to take this opportunity to pass on our blessings to the members of the Jewish community who began the observance of Purim tonight. For those who are not aware, Purim begins on March 6th this year and will continue through Tuesday, March 7th, extending, of course, through Wednesday in Jerusalem, Israel. It does commemorate the divinity orchestrated salvation of the Jewish people in ancient Persia from the hands of Haman's plot, which was to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, infants and women, in a single day. So Purim literally does mean lots in ancient Persian, and was named so given the fact that Haman had thrown lots to determine which day he would carry out his scheme, as it has been now recorded in the Megillah, or the Book of Esther. So again, for our Jewish audiences out there, blessings to all the observant Jews who are celebrating Purim tonight. Before we begin introducing my guest, a word from our sponsor.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
My honored guest today is Douglas Burton. Doug is an award-winning conflict reporter that's specializing in Nigerian war news. He is a former U.S. State Department official who was stationed in Kirkuk, Iraq at the time I was deployed to Iraq. He writes news and commentary from Washington, D.C. Doug is a mentor for other writers in Nigeria and also co-authors reports with them in the Epoch Times and also the Catholic News Agency. His work has been featured on Fox Nation, the American Thought Leaders, and also the Westminster Institute and Washington Times. Having served the Washington Times Corporation as an assignment editor for nearly 2 decades, Doug brought his skills to Baghdad to support the U.S. surge there for 2 years. He covered the campaign against the Islamic State until 2017, and then switched over reporting on the persecution of the Christians in Nigeria shortly afterwards. He did produce the complete story about the blasphemy murders of Deborah Emanuel, who was killed on May 12, 2022 in Nigeria's northern city of Sokoto. Doug is here today to discuss the new red colonialism and China's Middle East and also African economic goals. Doug, it's a pleasure again to have you here on my podcast tonight. I know it was for viewers out there who didn't know, we were just interviewed on NTTV, or New Tang Dynasty TV, which is a product of Epoch News, just this past weekend, along with Pearl Matebe on the International Reporters Roundtable, where we were discussing the tactical importance of Africa to China and how they are fueling their ambitions and also how the U.S. is responding. So I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Colonel Sargis. It's an honor to be on New Paradigms and good to talk to you again.
No, look, I do want to start with where we initially met, Doug, and we've had an opportunity now over the years to kind of reflect back on what happened with Iraq specifically, and what happened in the 20 plus years we've been in the Middle East, and now we know that China's moving in I just wanted to take your impressions as far as what you've been able to reflect on over the years that you were down range in Iraq, serving to try to see if there would be a change within that region.
Sargis, I just have mixed feelings about that whole experience in Iraq. Every time I see the tunnels to towers, promotions, I see men and women, especially men, who gave everything. They just were lucky to come back alive. But those were the guys. Some of those guys, they were the people who protected me as I went to work every day in a Humvee in Kirkuk. And I have nothing but the highest regard for the people who volunteered to serve in our military. I just wish we could have saved more of the persecuted minorities in northern Iraq. I remember that when I started serving there, we had hundreds of thousands of Christians. I don't know how many were in northern Iraq in 2005, but I think, from 2002, there was 1.2 million Christians, and I was helping to recruit some of those folks to go on our Fulbright scholarship programs. That was my job in Baghdad. During the time I was in Kirkuk, that number of Christians in northern Iraq, it was whittled down to just, 50 to 100,000 people. It was such a drain. It was heartbreaking. And I wish that our government had done more to keep those folks there, because they're such a stabilizing force and such a national security asset for our country.
No, they are. I always say it's no longer about quantity, it's about the quality of the type of support you get. If it was about quantity, there's plenty of folks downrange that have the numbers, but they were never a good ally for us. And they ended up usually losing, even internally. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. The Taliban with a small group literally does a number on, the forces that we trained over a 20-year period.
Yeah.
But again, like you said, we went from 1.5 million Christians to basically being eradicated, the root of Christianity in the region. It is unfortunate, but it's a reality. And, as we had been talking in the past, you could have siege SOTF on the ground, U.S. Delta forces, Navy SEALs, tasking units, the European Union, NATO, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Georgians, and they couldn't protect the Christians because we didn't have an understanding of long-term planning, right? We know that
Right.
the Chinese have a long-term plan. They have a 50-year and a 100-year plan, and they've been able to maneuver through the landscape, fighting against other nations' interests for wanting to get into the region. I know we're going to talk a little bit about Africa today, but I do want to kind of look at what they have done now, the Chinese and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, moving into the Middle East. There's a video that I do want to kind of reflect on how we may have lost the Middle East to our competitors. So we'll begin with that video.
China's President Xi Jinping has met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh on a, quote, pioneering trip to open a new era of China's relations with the Arab world. That's in Xi's own words. The visit is Xi's first to the kingdom in 6 years. The two countries affirmed their ties and signed a series of strategic deals, including one with tech giant Huawei. The Chinese leader is expected to meet more Gulf oil producers later. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Andrew Small, an Asia expert with the German Marshall Fund here in Berlin. Now, the partnership between Saudi Arabia and China, what makes it so important?
Well, first of all, it's unavoidable that the energy piece of the relationship is at the core. This is critical to China at a time in which the energy situation in the world, energy pricing, is in a more difficult spot. But Saudi Arabia occupies an important role across a whole series of different dimensions of Chinese foreign policy at the moment. China always pursues a kind of balanced approach to its diplomacy in the Middle East. It does have to balance its relationship with Iran, with Israel, with Turkey, and with Egypt as the kind of traditional mainstays of its policy there. But Saudi Arabia is by far its most important energy partner. It's been a security partner in missile technology and sales going back a long way. So there is a security dimension to the relationship as well. But it occupies an important role in the Muslim world, particularly when China's navigating issues with Xinjiang and what's been playing out with its Uyghur minority there. So in that respect, Saudi Arabia matters a lot. But in this wider context of the struggle with the United States, kind of peeling away a little bit traditionally close US partners, I think is still understood to be important to China. Its positioning across the whole of the developing world and non-aligned world right now, and even in financial terms, which is another dimension of the relationship. Saudi Arabia matters in the context of building a kind of resilient to sanctions international financial architecture. So Saudi Arabia really sits at the center of quite a number of Chinese foreign policy objectives right now.
Well, Saudi Arabia is one thing, but during his visit to the Saudi capital, she is not just meeting Saudi officials, but also other Arab leaders like Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi or Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Why is he doing that?
Well, I mean, first of all, of course, he couldn't just go to Saudi Arabia for some of the reasons of political balance that I mentioned before. But this is a context in which certainly there is a kind of rebalancing going on in the Middle East. The US pivot to Asia, rebalancing away from the depth of security role and the importance of the energy relationships in the region means that China, although it doesn't want to step into the kind of role that the United States occupied, there are states in the region that are looking to upgrade their relations. This was underway already, of course, for commercial reasons. But there is a sense in which China is positioning itself to occupy a more comprehensive role in the region in the longer term. So all of these relationships, the Gulf states, Egypt, and the other cases as well, matter very much for Chinese interests in the wider strategic context as well.
Andrew Small there from the German Marshall Fund. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Doug, I know that Andrew is going to be surprised. He's like, you gave me some airtime today. Thanks, Colonel. But look, I wanted to give an opportunity as far as how others in the European context are looking at the region. But I wanted to get our American perspective on it because it's very important, key, especially the fact that we spend so much treasure, as you said. I'm a member of the Wounded Warrior Program myself, and what has been sacrificed there. Your thoughts about what Andrew had basically said, and in the context of how America needs to be looking at the CCP and what's been able to do within the region.
Well, sure. Sargis, China is seeking to maximize its opportunity in Africa, just as it is doing with Saudi Arabia. But even more so in Africa, China is seeking to test its own governance system of state-led economic growth led by authoritarian single-party states. So China has a great plan for African alliances and has prioritized Africa for more than 2 decades. Of course, as we know, China had very strong relationships during the Cold War with many African countries. But in the last 20 to 25 years, China has initiated something new. As China has become a hugely profitable, a hugely important economy, almost the same size as the U.S. economy. Now, China seeks to replace the United States as the world superpower. And to do this, it is seeking to expand the borders of its control to the 54 countries in Africa. It's key to China's growth, and it's key to their projection of their governing system. As I said, their economic system and their political system. China is testing its own structure, its own ideas, its values, and its methods in Africa. And if it succeeds, it certainly will put the United States in its shadow. And let's keep in mind, the African populations are growing. All the African countries, especially the big African country, Nigeria, its population is about the fastest growing population in the world. China's own population is aging. In 25 years, China is going to have 100 million people fewer than it has right now. Meanwhile, Nigeria will have, certainly 100 million more people than it has today.
I know that when we initially talked on Saturday, I did mention the new power relations plan that Wang Yi had proposed at the Brookings Institute. Unfortunately, at that time, we thought that there would be an American counter to it. And this was Wang Yi's concept as to what the relationship needs to look like between the U.S. and China. But it was really China's vision for the world and how it could be in peace, of course, on behalf of China. Unfortunately, Susan Rice tried to actualize it in her speech at George Washington University. And that's when, President Obama had talked about a managed decline. The same individuals who are now advising the current administration, the current POTUS, were the same people who were actually looking at that particular plan. Do you think, based on what we've seen in the Middle East, we had that one photo up where even the Mandarin Chinese is being taught by Chinese themselves in northern Iraq to one of our supposedly strongest allies, the Kurds, who you had served with on the ground during the operations there as you were covering it. And it seems that there's been an agreement possibly that was reached that where the battlefield for economic struggles in Africa was going to be on a competitive basis. But I think based on what you know about covering Nigeria, it doesn't seem that China has the same vision as far as what fair competitive nature in Africa is supposed to be. Now, either we've agreed on as we call it, the red imperialism, where China basically is going to be dominating Africa, and maybe in the long run, it benefits Western businesses too, because China can do some things that we cannot do in the region. Do you see that, or do you think there's any kind of a link that may show that maybe that's how it's being hedged as far as what the competition would look like in Africa from your perspective?
Oh, yeah. The Chinese want to present themselves as giving a win-win situation to every country in which they're engaged. Of course, they come into Africa saying, look, China, we are the largest developing country in the world. Africa is home to 54 developing countries. We all have a lot in common. None of us want to be exploited by the old colonial powers. We don't want to be misused. We don't want to be roughly treated or hurt by the United States. And at the same time, China is using soft power. One reason it's got Confucius Institute in northern Iraq is that it wants to create a great environment for the Kurdish students to go to China and study in graduate school. And in China, for example, in Africa, there are over 80,000 African students who are studying in China every year. China has made itself a destination for graduate school. According to our sources, Nigeria is sending 750 to 800 Nigerian grad students to China every year. I think at this point, since they started emphasizing this program about 8 years ago, there must be at least 5,000 Nigerians who have graduated from Chinese schools. Many of these graduates are in technical schools in computer sciences or engineering, and thousands of them very likely are back in Nigeria now. And so it's the way that they're presenting themselves as a true friend to the African countries. They have a tailor-made relationship with every country. They've created a very canny, very brilliant plan for making a customized approach to each of the 54 countries. And if you look at their literature that's presented to the Nigerian students, it's cost effective to go to China. They have the language program that they're offering right there in Lagos. And since the Nigerians are thirsty for knowledge. They see education as the key, absolutely, to financial investment. Of course, they're taking on this opportunity. There's more graduate students in Nigeria than could possibly be absorbed by the United States or the UK. So they're very smart in that way. So the Chinese are very savvy with the way they are engaging all of these countries.
No, who's trained the Chinese to work that way? Because really, when we talk about China, China as a geographic location is really the Chinese Communist Party. And they do not come across as the Green Gang as being individuals that are able to think at that strategic level. You think there's a little bit of maybe a push by Western nations that may have had previous interactions with the Chinese leadership that has gauged them to want to approach basically developing areas as they are, whether it be in Africa or the Middle East? Or do you think it's something that's just been in their 100-year and 50-year plan, that they're just basically ahead of schedule? And if that's the case, it's amazing how that plan hasn't really deviated over a 100-year period from where they want to be.
I can't speak to the Green Gang at all. What I can say that it's my observation. The Chinese people are inherently entrepreneurial. I mean, it's a nation of business starters, of shopkeepers, of brilliant people, and they find in Africa huge opportunities. According to what I've read, many of the Chinese migrants who come to Nigeria, for example, to work on road projects or to do mining, after their work program or their contract is over, they stay in Nigeria. They marry people in Nigeria. They stay there. They like Africa. They find it more freedom, frankly, in African countries than they would have back home. So there's a natural kinship that's happening. It happens because people are working together. Many of the companies, though they're on the surface, they're controlled by the government. They have to have a contractual relationship with the government. But the Chinese entrepreneurs in Africa, they can make fortunes. They can make fortunes by having their own businesses. There are many, hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese ventures in the northwest of Nigeria, for example. Gold mining is very widespread. Illegal gold mining is very common. Yeah. So the Chinese, once they're there, they can multiply their opportunities, and they can and it can be a win-win situation with the Nigerian people, who also are they're very intelligent, they're very versatile, they're resilient, they're looking for opportunity. Their own government has cheated them of the opportunity to find education, cheated them of the opportunity to get factory jobs. Here come the Chinese, and they're offering all of those things.
No, when I was in Kenya, one of the things we realized is that I went to the slum area there, and the State Department and also the U.S. Embassy wouldn't allow anyone to travel into those slums. But guess who was there? I went there to observe the Chinese. The Chinese are all over the slums. These are the high crime areas. But what they do is they come in and they're literally taking over what a distributor would be doing there. So they're taking over the distribution. They're kind of cutting off the cities from economic ties, as an example, because if they're creating those Chinese centers in every city, what ends up happening is, before you would go from city A to city B in Kenya, because city B offered something different in that trade. I mean, when they established these chokeholds, they really destroyed that economy that was initially built, that fit this individuals on the ground. As you know yourself, and you've said this, that either you belong to the political party and you're in the governmental structure and you're a billionaire overnight, or you're actually dying to find some money in order to be able to feed yourself the next day. So with them coming in initially, really kind of tearing that economic fabric to pieces, and now you're beholden to the Chinese distributors, the Chinese monies and dollars. The secondhand, underground businesses are all gone. Now it's ripe to set it to be able to control it politically. And as I've said in the past, if you can economically control it, then you could choose the politicians that are going to get elected, and those politicians now turn around and assign the general officers in charge of their military forces, and now those general officers are the ones that actually start striking the possible coalition with other regional militaries. And unfortunately, as I saw in Burma, and I use that example in our discussion on Saturday, that what they do, it was a Saturday broadcast. What the Chinese did, they in Burma, they linked up with General Halang and his group, and they went into one of the most remote areas of Arakan and basically conducted ethnical cleansing in order to be able to bring their billion-dollar conglomerate to conduct a $14 billion build in order to strategically bypass America's ability to control the straits there in order to be able to have a geostrategic tactical advantage against China when it comes to in the future if we ever have to get into a shooting war with them. You've seen some of these things of what they're doing in Nigeria. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what they might be doing in the ports and how they're trying to control those areas in Nigeria, and why is Nigeria so important and key for China rather than any other place that they're engaged right now?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, Sargis. Well, Nigeria is the largest country in Africa. It has the largest population, and it's the wealthiest country. It's hugely influential. Because of its trade power. It sets an example economically and politically for all the surrounding countries. So if Nigeria were, God forbid, to become an Islamic caliphate, it would certainly spread to the surrounding countries. By the same token, if Nigeria becomes a successful market-based economy, if it has a successful democracy, then that is also going to be replicated in the 8 surrounding countries. I mean, in one sense, Nigeria is a model for all, not only sub-Saharan Africa, but all of Northern Africa as well. So this port, a massive port that the Chinese were building for 8 years, was opened just about 3.5 weeks ago. We did a story about it for the Epoch Times. Now, this port has huge implications. And by the way, it's not a Nigerian port. It's completely owned by the Chinese. All the funding came from Chinese banks, and the repayment arrangement will allow the governance, allow the ownership to transfer from China to the Nigerian government, I think in 2045 or 2046. So this is a Chinese port, Chinese control, Chinese surveillance, Chinese profit. Now, the other thing that's important for this port in Lagos, it's a deep sea port. This is not like the Chinese finance port in Equatorial Guinea, which is actually a little bit inland on the river, and it's not a deep sea port, and it is not seen as a likely location for Chinese naval vessels. But this port in Lagos, it's out on an island. It's perfect. It'd be perfect to service a Chinese aircraft carrier someday. Might be soon. But in addition, this transportation center will be the hub for containers, shipping containers for all of Africa. And in addition, the Chinese have a special logistical system. It's a proprietary software system for tracking all of the items and the values of the cargoes that go upriver into Nigeria and into surrounding countries. Now, think about the trade, think about the competitive advantages that the Chinese port operators will have. They know all of the cargoes going into the surrounding countries like Benin, Mauritania, Chad, Niger Republic, and they know all the cargoes going out into the Atlantic Ocean and their values. Now think about the trade advantage they would have, say, 10 or 20 years from now. With these cargoes that are going into West Africa are wholesale, right? They're finished goods, all kinds of chemicals and so forth. But in a few years, this logistical system can be expanded out to deliveries to individual consumers. Think of it as this is a grip or a purchase of land and a purchase economically for China to have a consumer distribution center like Amazon all over West Africa. Think of the trillions and trillions of profits and the trade advantages that China would have, and not to mention essential knowledge about about dual use items, such as uranium, for example, metals and other goods that will be absolutely important in case there's a war between countries, or God forbid there would be a war between China and the West, and African nations may be a part of that.
Well, if they would be right now, they would be probably on the China side, because China owns most locations. I mean, look, in the Uganda's main airport, Entebbe Airport, which is famous. They've done a movie about it, where Benjamin Netanyahu's brother was killed in an operation. But when they came in, they said, we're not taking over the airport, but we're going to give you 0% investment, or I should say 0% on a grant that we're going to give you, which was taken by the Ugandan government. Oh, by the way, we're not going to tell you that during the survey time, we kind of looked at some of the mining areas, and we've been sucking, illegally out of your gold mines, which is paying us on the back end to begin with. And if you decide that you want to do anything in the airport authority, we have the first right to refuse, because it's tied into our long-term paying back the loan over a 20-year period, that we can dictate whether or not how they even use their budget. So they might not be physically holding the airport, which is the only international airport that Uganda has, which is a tactical location that could be used in a future war. But they basically own it by the fact that they could tell the airport authorities how to spend their money in order to pay back the loans that they own to the Chinese that initially was received. And I do know that at the same time, Nigeria is important for us, because Nigeria just went through an election, and we did put up a little pic that showed about whether or not China is involved in the elections in the region. I do want to start with a video that is going to talk about what happened in the Nigerian elections, and then kind of get your thoughts about what they're doing, China is doing, or the CCP and politically within the region, besides how it's using its economic power.
The results are in. Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been declared the winner of Nigeria's presidential race. But opposition parties are contesting the outcome. President-elect Tinubu is known as a political kingmaker and is one of the most influential people in the country. He was expected to win by those who thought he'd call in favors with the governors he's helped elect across the nation. But the youth have galvanized the platform of 61-year-old Labour Party Peter Obi, who beat Tinubu in his backyard in Lagos State. Opposition parties have called this election a sham, and today, in the wake of the announcement, the People's Democratic Party, the main opposition party, have mobilized people here in protest, asking for the election results to be nullified. Voter disenfranchisement and incidences of violence at polling stations across the country, as well as the failure of the Electoral Commission to digitally upload results, have left many people here feeling like the electoral process was not successful. Tinubu has cited his experience as a private businessman, an accountant, and a former governor as indication of his capacity to lead the country out of economic ruin. His campaign is one of renewed hope, but the young people we've met have said that he doesn't represent them, and many of them are contesting his win. Nigeria's elections always seem to be decided in the courts, and opposition parties have 21 days to appeal the result. Given the president-elect won't be inaugurated until May, the months to come will be critical to truly understanding what the outcome of this election really is.
Doug, as you said in your comments earlier, the way Nigeria goes is probably how Africa is going to go. At least East Africa, and later on it will expand to the rest of Africa. Your thoughts on what happened in that election? What was possibly maybe a Chinese role in it, and where is the U.S. right now as far as trying to offer some kind of a resolution maybe to what has happened with the election integrity issues?
Well, Sargis, I can't say that I see any Chinese involvement here. But clearly in Nigeria, there's a clash of civilizations. The Chinese are testing their one-party authoritarian system of governance. They are promoting it, and they're seeking to persuade the African countries to see China as a model of what they can be: state-led economic growth and non-democratic rule. Now, that there's nothing that a dictator in Africa could want more than that. What we've seen since February 25, which was the presidential election, is probably the greatest election steal in history. I mean, this was a very large number of registered voters, 93 million. There was a low voter turnout, possibly because of voter suppression. The U.S. Ambassador Mary Beth Leonard said that very, very diplomatically, she said that the implementation of the election disappointed many Nigerians. Well, I'd say that's understatement. In fact, the Nigerians that I've been spoken to on the ground are outraged. They are furious. They say this is the worst election in their history, and all the opposition parties feel cheated, and they will challenge the result in court. But here's, the problem is that the Independent Nigerian Election Commission invited the nation and the world to look over the shoulders of the polling unit managers at the precinct level. And during that election, you had 176,000 precinct operators, precinct polling staffers who were counting the ballots that came in. And in many of these polling units, the local people were standing there right next to them, right in front of them, and they were counting the votes with them. They were looking over their shoulder, and every single ballot that was counted would be pronounced by the crowd. The numbers were shown on the ballot tally sheets, and they were videotaped. They were pictured. There were thousands, tens of thousands of Nigerians who photographed these tally sheets with their own phones, and they sent them all around social media. Now, meantime, the results, it was promised that they would be uploaded in real time to a server in Lagos, and the results of the election would be known by everyone, right away. Well, of course, this didn't happen. It's debatable whether that was predetermined. It was deliberately done by the Independent Nigerian Election Commission because it was they had planned to steal the election. Well, we don't know if it was deliberate or not, but clearly the results were not uploaded. But here's the problem: those tallies at the precinct level don't match what was collated at the central collation centers for the government. The results for the Labour Party candidate, which is the anti-establishment party led by Mr. Peter Obi, he's a Roman Catholic. He got a landslide victory. Not only did he got a victory in the largest city of Lagos, but he got a victory, I think, in 19 states. But this was not reflected in the totals that were amassed and then put out in the Central Collation Center. Now, here's the role that we would expect the leader of the free world to play here. It would not be the role of a diffident standoff observer who is afraid to offend the government, which is essentially what I see the U.S. Government doing. It would be the role of championing democracy. Now, China hasn't complained about this election result. They're not bothered by whether or not it was fair or unfair. They don't believe in elections. So here is where we need champions of fairness and tolerance on the Western side to be courageous and not play as if they're afraid to lose their client and lose their trading privileges in Nigeria. Because if democracy fails in this country, it will fail in other countries as well. This failure of an election, it is being noticed by 53 other countries. And it bodes very, very poorly for U.S. influence. The U.S. cannot be trusted as a standard bearer of democracy. Well, I mean, if you talk to conservatives in the United States, that role has already been abandoned in the 2020 election and the 2022 midterms. But the United States still has a role to play as a defender of accountability of the elites to the people. And that is what is being challenged by the Nigerians. We are going to hear a lot about this election in the coming weeks and months. This election, it appears, according to what my sources are telling me, the Nigerians are saying, this election is a deal breaker. They cannot trust this government, and they cannot they cannot show loyalty to a government that has cheated them so profoundly. A lot has to be recompensed before the people can trust their government again. And in fact, there are very large blocks of voters in Nigeria who would like to break away and have their own country. You know, there was 70 years ago, there was a genocidal war based in the southeast, in Lagos and in the other southeastern states around the breakaway of the Igbo tribal group. That was the Biafra group. But now there's a group of another large tribe in the southwest, the Yoruba people. They want their own autonomy, and some of them want their own country. So the fissures are getting deeper in this country as a result of this fraudulent election.
It is unfortunate, but I mean, we've seen election issues across the board everywhere. I mean, I ran in 2020, and for a second, I thought you were describing Chicago politics when you're talking about what happened in Nigeria. Unfortunately, I know we laugh about it, but it's sad, you know. But you know, the bad part of it is, you know, with the Christians in Nigeria being targeted, if there's ever a fight. Unfortunately, the Islamic radicals bring guns to the table, and the poor farmer, Christian farmer, basically has a shovel. So it's not going to work out well for them. And look, we saw these fissures taking place. I go back again. I think what happens in Nigeria is going to really show what maybe the kingmakers have agreed upon. Again, I go back to what I wrote in 2015, and again reiterated based on what was happening in the European war just last year. As to the new power relations. And it seems like we'll find out pretty soon, depending on how we approach Nigeria, whether or not the kingmakers have agreed that they should be a red imperialism led by China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has the Russians and the Iranians who are invested heavily in Northern Africa with all the issues they're dealing with. They put a lot of money there to be able to possibly control the rights to the minerals and everything else. I do want to take a break, halfway point for our sponsor, and then come back and show you videos for some of the effects that are happening on the ground based on what China is doing and others really destroying the environment of Africa, and then kind of get your closing thoughts on some of these topics. So with that said, a word from our sponsor.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
Look, as we've talked in the past, and I talked to you on Saturday, you know, about what the Chinese were doing in South Sudan was basically mimicking what they did in Burma. I know that in the past I've said that the Republic of Congo has enough minerals in it that you can buy the entire state of Israel with. and everybody's now rushing there. And South Sudan is kind of that point where you can now go from northern, Africa, which is still Arab-based cultures, into the heart of Africa itself, and of course the Republic of Congo. There's a video I'm going to show, and then come back and talk about how you're going to counter this if China has already been able to, put his tentacles in, going back now almost 2 decades.
These miners work at one of the largest informal cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. For the first time, some of them have been given safety jackets and hard hats, and the managers plan to limit their number. But things didn't go to plan. Thousands of miners want to work here. None of them can afford to miss a day's digging. There are few jobs in Congo, but growing demand for electric vehicle batteries, for which cobalt is used, means these men can earn about $4 a day. About a fifth of the country's cobalt is extracted by hand in what are known as artisanal mines. Most of them are illegal. Nobody counts the accidents and deaths. The government says it wants to formalise the sector and buy all its cobalt.
The government has to control the price, the government has to control the production, the government has to control everything. It has to be. Otherwise, anyone can come in the country and do everything they want to do.
The government says it will open new artisanal mining sites. It's not clear what will happen to the existing mines. Bosses are worried they'll be shut down for breaking rules. That's why they're providing hard hats for the first time. We met the man who controls this mine at the hotel he's building in the nearby city of Kolwezi. He says he's frustrated by the government's plan called General Cobalt Enterprise, or EGC.
If EGC prioritizes creating a monopoly, it will be a problem. For us, the priority is to formalize the artisanal mining sector. We don't want to be blocked. We'll continue selling minerals to those who actually finance our operations.
Back at the mine, the shift is cut short. Managers say they need more time to make it safe.
It's a disappointing day for the thousands of men who work in this pit. In Congo, there are about 200,000 artisanal cobalt miners, about 1 million people who depend on this economic activity. A small number of people are getting very rich from the cobalt mining industry, but that's not the case for almost all of the people here.
They'll barely be paid anything for the short shift, if at all.
There's no order here. We need order because we are too many. They need to divide the people into groups to work on different days.
We're appealing for better conditions so we can work properly. None of us have a good position in life. If we weren't here, we'd be stealing things in town to survive.
Many are wondering if any reforms will actually happen, and miners are wondering if they'll make them safer or cost them their jobs. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Kawama Mine, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Doug, everybody's involved in those mines. Chinese are involved in them heavily with investments. I guess the question would be, I know that U.S. recently, of course, after the summit that had taken place last year in Washington, D.C., with some memorandums of agreement being agreed upon. Again, I tell people, unless it's a treaty, it has really no legal standing because it's not part of U.S. law. As you know yourself, serving in the State Department. My question would be, with what we've seen with some of the discussions that have taken place with American leadership traveling to Africa, why is the United States leadership under the current administration still pushing nations to look at these so-called Green New Deals, even in Africa, especially in the nations that are rich in oil in Africa? Isn't that just pushing them more into the hands of the Chinese and causing these type of issues?
Sargis, you've raised a huge question, and frankly, I have no answer. I cannot speak for the U.S. government. It seems illogical. It seems against common sense that nations that are oil rich would want to shift to wind farms and solar panels that will have to be manufactured in China and then shipped into these African countries. It's really absurd to think that African people who are making as little as $2 or $3 a day are going to be able to afford electric cars. Clearly, the economic model in Africa has to be custom made for these conditions of the African people. And in that film that you just showed, we see the tragic exploitation of ordinary people, men who are just desperate to support their wives and children. Who's taking care of them? Obviously, a nation that has put 1 million people into concentration camps, in Western China, is not going to be the champion for the human rights of people in the Congo, or the human rights of Nigerians, or of any of the people in West Africa. The champion of human rights has to be a nation or a civilization that prizes the individual, and that is where the United States has to show leadership, or countries in the West should step in. Honestly, I have to just tell you that I saw something similar in Kirkuk when I was there, and as a political conservative, I just decided to not try to stage manage political elites to take over all the resources. I tried to get civil society groups in the United States to partner with civil society groups in Kirkuk, and I urge the same thing for Nigeria. What we did in Kirkuk is we contacted Boy Scout and Girl Scout organizations and partnered them with Boy Scout and Girl Scout organizations in Kirkuk, and the Iraqis, the Kurds, just loved it. I think this has to be done in a nation like Nigeria. After all, the common language in Nigeria is English. It's our language. Americans can't communicate with people in Arabic or Kurdish or Persian, but most of the Nigerian people can speak English. And the Nigerians are in the United States. There's at least 2 million Nigerian expatriates here. If you add up all the African expatriates that live in the United States, you're talking about 10, 15 million people. It's a very large group of American citizens, or people who will become American citizens. And besides that, there's a cultural consensus between people in West Africa, especially Nigeria, and the United States. Both are governments that are based upon a constitution which is respected and has been based upon the Western model. If the Eastern model of an authoritarian model like China becomes the standard in West Africa, it will be a tragedy. It means that these governments will not be accountable to the ordinary citizen. So I would suggest that, just as other human rights advocates like Bernard Levy-Strauss has argued, let the little platoons of do-gooders find their counterparts in the developing world, in Nigeria, and let pastors, let priests, let bishops in the United States connect with pastors and bishops in the killing zones and where Christians are being murdered in the Middle Belt. And let's raise awareness, and let's raise awareness about the atrocities that are happening. At the same time, let's show confidence that democracy can work in Western African countries. The U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, our founding documents are treasures. We should honor them. We should insist upon fair elections in this country. We should reach out to our African brothers and sisters on the basis of the common good, upon the value of universal human rights, and if you're a believer, as I am, upon the intrinsic value of a person as a child of God, and recognize that the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is a right, it's a claim, it's an aspiration that is universal. And our civilization has attempted to fulfill it. We can't see that happening in the communistic system. The United States has enjoyed the prestige of leading. It has enjoyed the admiration of the world because of these values. and it must not abandon, must not abdicate the role of moral leadership now.
Well said, and somewhat it feels like the people who are advocating moral leadership are the ones who are now maybe in agreement as kingmakers for Africa that China needs to plant a red colonialism all over Africa in order, as long as they get their profits, maybe not directly because of U.S. involvement there, but maybe indirectly because of the fact that they have ties to Chinese business conglomerates that are really wreaking havoc over Africa. I hope that's not the reality, but we'll see what the reaction is going to be with what we decide to do as far as our stand with the elections in Nigeria and future elections are coming up in Africa. Doug, it was a pleasure to have you here. I wish we could sit here and talk for more, but we've already hit our hour max almost here. And I do want to make sure our viewers know that if you guys want to see what Doug has written in the past, please use the QR code and you'll be able to see all his articles, especially all the ones that have been posted on Epoch Time, which is one of our sponsors for the show. And with that said, also, Doug, just so you know, when we were in Africa, of course, we had linked up with Jacaranda Women Organization to help with the South Sudanese refugee issues. A United Us in Appeal, as you know, I established it when we were getting money in order for young Assyrian Christians could be able to fight in both Iraq and Syria. We are supporting all the Christians of the Near East and adjacent countries, which South Sudan becomes one. So whatever donations that could be done, if you like our program, much appreciated. And again, a wonderful job by Sim Production by giving us the opportunity to bring great guests like you here. And Fred is doing an outstanding job out of California. Doug, with that said, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we'll sign off, and hopefully we'll have you back on the show again.
Well, thank you, Sargis. Let's keep this dialogue going. Let's keep the focus on Africa as the nation that will be really, Africa not as a nation, but as a continent that will be the wealthiest and most productive continent in the world in just a few decades. It's going to rival Asia. Let's keep in mind that the peoples of Africa are just like us. They seek marriage, family, children, owning their own homes. They all have cell phones. Many have smartphones, and they can be reached just by they can be reached with a cell phone. You can call using an app like WhatsApp and pay virtually nothing. Let's encourage people in the United States to reach out and make friends in Nigeria, talk to people, find out what they're experiencing. And if you can't help in any other way, just pray with them. Just pray with them and give them moral support for going through their struggles. And in so doing, it will all of this effort, psychically, spiritually, it will redound back to us.
I have no doubt, Doug. I know it will, and we are going to continue bringing the plight of what is happening in Africa to bear, because it is a national security issue for us from the U.S. side. And again, I'd rather have the U.S. finally take that moral courage path and understand that the Chinese Communist Party cannot be given an opportunity to expand its red colonialism all over Africa. If it does, then you lose a war in Europe, because Russia and Iran will bypass all your possible sanctions that you have put on them. And the fact that they've just signed a new agreement on the mineral rights, once they have their hands on all the minerals, as you know yourself, we were surprised that the Iraq Central Bank decided to go with the yuan for their currency by dropping the U.S. dollar. They could now have enough leverage to say that we are going to transition off of the dollar. If that ever happens, then you might as forget about all the investments that even union leaders have done through BlackRock and other organizations into Chinese conglomerates in the future. Doug, it was a pleasure having you here. We'll have you back again. And God's blessing. Thank you for all the work you have done in the past for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Sargis.
Thank you, guys. And with that said, there's new paradigms. God bless. See you next week.
Thank you, sir.